You're not here by accident. Something brought you to this moment, to this exact point in your life where things feel different. Maybe you can't fully explain it. Maybe it's just a quiet awareness sitting in the back of your mind. But it's there, and it's getting louder. There's a sense that time is moving faster than it used to. Days blur together. Weeks disappear before you even process them. And deep down, there's a question you keep avoiding. What am I really doing with my time? This isn't about a clock on the wall. This is something deeper. Something most people never stop long enough to notice, because it's easier not to. It's easier to stay distracted, to keep scrolling, to keep telling yourself there's still plenty of time left. But what if that isn't true? What if the time you think you have isn't as much as you believe? There's a difference between living and drifting. And most people don't realize they've been drifting until they look back and see how much has already slipped away. Opportunities that were never taken, ideas that were never acted on, versions of themselves that were never explored. You feel it, don't you? That tension between where you are and where you know you could be. That quiet voice telling you that you're capable of more, but something keeps holding you in place. This is where it starts to matter, because awareness changes everything. The moment you start to see it, you can't unsee it. The patterns, the habits, the time spent on things that don't move your life forward, it all becomes clear. And clarity can be uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. Because once you recognize what's really happening, you're faced with a choice. You can keep moving the way you always have, hoping things somehow change on their own, or you can acknowledge that something needs to shift. This moment right now is more important than it seems. Not because everything has to change instantly, but because this is where the realization begins. This is where you stop ignoring the feeling that something is off. This is where you start paying attention. And once you do that, everything that follows starts to look different. 1. The urgency no one talks about. There is a kind of urgency that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with alarms, warnings, or obvious signs. It doesn't scream at you. Instead, it quietly shapes your life in the background while you convince yourself that everything is still under control. This is the urgency no one talks about. Because most people imagine time as something steady, something always available, something that can be delayed, postponed, or handled later. But that illusion is exactly what makes it dangerous. Time doesn't wait for clarity. It doesn't pause for motivation. It doesn't slow down when you feel unready. It keeps moving. And while it moves, something else is happening at the same time. Your life is being shaped by what you are not doing just as much as by what you are doing. Every decision to delay becomes a pattern. Every "I'll start tomorrow" becomes a silent agreement with stagnation. Every ignored idea becomes a closed door you stop noticing over time. And slowly, without dramatic moments or obvious breakdowns, your potential starts to shrink into what feels normal. That is the real danger. Not failure, not mistakes, but the slow acceptance of less. You don't notice it happening because life keeps you busy enough to feel productive. There are responsibilities, distractions, routines, and obligations. There is always something demanding your attention right now, and because of that it feels like you still have time to figure everything out later. But later is where most dreams quietly disappear. Time doesn't collapse in one moment, it leaks. It slips through decisions that seem small in the moment, but become massive in hindsight. A week becomes a month becomes a year. And suddenly, you are not where you planned to be. You are where your habits placed you, and habits are built in silence. No one sees the hours you spend avoiding what matters. No one measures the opportunities you didn't take. No one tracks the potential you postponed. But life records it anyway, in outcomes you eventually have to face. This is why the urgency is so difficult to notice. Because it doesn't feel like urgency while you're inside it. It feels like delay. It feels like not yet. It feels like you are still in control of the timeline. But in reality, the timeline is already moving without permission. And the most unsettling part is this. The longer you wait, the more normal waiting becomes. At first you feel resistance, then hesitation, then comfort. And eventually, you stop questioning it altogether. You stop asking why you haven't started. You stop measuring how far you could have gone. You stop imagining a different version of your life because it starts to feel distant. But distance is not the same as impossibility. What makes this urgency dangerous is not that it destroys you suddenly, it's that it reshapes your standards slowly. It convinces you that enough is whatever you currently have, even if deep down you know you were meant for more. And that quiet contradiction is where everything begins to shift. Because once you start noticing how time actually works, not as something endless but as something constantly being spent, you can no longer ignore the pressure it creates. And that pressure is not meant to break you, it is meant to wake you up. 2. Signs your clock is almost at zero. There are moments in life where nothing looks visibly wrong, yet everything feels slightly off. You wake up, you go through your day, you complete what you need to do, but deep inside, there is a quiet awareness that something is not aligning anymore. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just consistently enough to feel it. These are the signs your clock is almost at zero. Not because your life is over, but because something important in you is being neglected for too long. And the most dangerous part is that you can still function while it happens. One of the first signs is the feeling of repetition without progress. You are doing things, staying active, even staying busy, but when you look at your life over time, nothing really feels different. The days change, but your direction doesn't. It feels like you are moving, but not arriving anywhere meaningful. And slowly, that creates a quiet frustration you can't fully explain. Another sign is when your dreams start feeling distant instead of urgent. There was a time when certain ideas, goals, or visions made your heart move. You thought about them often. You imagined different possibilities, but now, those same thoughts feel far away, almost unrealistic. Not because they are impossible, but because you have stopped feeding them attention, and without attention, everything fades. You may also notice that you have started accepting less than what you once wanted, not in one decision, but in many small compromises. You lower your expectations quietly. You convince yourself that this is fine for now. You adjust your standards to match your current situation, instead of challenging it. And over time, what was once temporary starts feeling permanent. Another sign is emotional fatigue from your own life. Not physical exhaustion, but a deeper kind. A feeling that you are tired of your own patterns, tired of repeating the same thoughts, tired of knowing what you should do, but not doing it. This creates an internal conflict where you are both aware and inactive at the same time, and that conflict drains you more than effort ever could. You might also notice avoidance becoming a habit. You delay important tasks, not because they are difficult, but because thinking about them creates discomfort. So you distract yourself, you scroll, you wait. You tell yourself you will start later when you feel more ready, more motivated, more certain, but readiness never arrives in the way you expect it to. It has to be chosen, not waited for. Another subtle sign is when time starts feeling faster than your actions. Weeks pass quicker than your progress, months disappear faster than your decisions. You feel like you are always catching up to life instead of shaping it. And that imbalance creates a quiet pressure that grows over time. Then comes one of the most important signs. You stop checking in with yourself honestly. You avoid asking hard questions. You stop measuring where you are versus where you said you would be. You avoid reflection because reflection creates discomfort. And without reflection, it becomes easier to stay where you are without realizing how long you have been there. But perhaps the most important sign is this. Deep down, you already know something is not aligned, even if you ignore it. Even if you stay distracted, even if you convince yourself otherwise. There is a part of you that notices the gap between your potential and your reality, and that awareness doesn't disappear, it just gets quieter when you stop listening. These signs are not meant to scare you, they are meant to make you aware of something that is already happening internally, because the clock does not stop when you ignore it. It does not reset when you delay, it keeps moving regardless of how you feel about it. And the longer you ignore these signs, the more normal they start to feel. Until one day, you look back and realize they were never just signs. They were warnings you understood, but didn't act on. 3. Why you don't realize it. The strange part about losing time in your life is that it rarely feels like you are losing anything at all while it is happening. You don't wake up one day and suddenly realize everything slipped away. Instead, it happens in a way that feels completely normal, almost invisible, until much later when you finally look back and try to understand how you got here. This is not because you are careless or unaware, it is because the human mind is built to adapt, not to constantly question itself. And that adaptation creates blind spots. areas where you stop seeing reality clearly because your mind has already accepted a version of it that feels easier to live with. One of the biggest blind spots is the illusion of being in progress. As long as you are doing something, your mind tells you that you are moving forward. You wake up, you handle tasks, you respond to messages, you stay active, and because there is activity, there is a feeling of productivity. But activity is not the same as direction. You can be extremely busy while still standing in the same place, and your mind often confuses the two. Another blind spot is the normalization of delay. When you postpone something once, it feels like a choice. When you postpone it again, it starts feeling like a habit. After enough repetition, it stops feeling like a delay at all. It becomes your default, and once something becomes your default, you no longer question it. You simply continue it. That is how time gets quietly absorbed without resistance. There is also the comfort bias, your mind's preference for what feels emotionally safe in the moment. Even when you know something important should be done, your brain naturally pushes you toward what feels easier right now. Not because it is better, but because it reduces discomfort. So you choose distraction over difficulty, familiarity over growth, and temporary relief over long-term change. Over time, this creates a pattern where comfort feels like stability. Another major blind spot is the future self illusion. You convince yourself that your future self will have more energy, more clarity, more discipline and more motivation than you do now. So you delay actions, assuming that a better version of you will handle them later. But that version never magically arrives. It only exists in the space where responsibility is postponed. And each time you delay, you reinforce the idea that it is not urgent. There is also emotional numbing. When you repeatedly ignore what you know you should do, your mind begins to reduce the emotional weight of it. At first it feels uncomfortable, then it feels annoying, then it starts to feel distant. Eventually, it barely triggers any emotional response at all. And when something no longer feels urgent emotionally, it becomes easier to ignore logically. That is how awareness slowly fades without disappearing completely. Another blind spot is comparison distortion. You look at others and assume they are ahead because they are more capable, more disciplined, or more fortunate. But what you don't see are their internal struggles, their private doubts, or the invisible effort behind their progress. This creates a false belief that your position is fixed while theirs is advancing naturally, and that belief weakens your sense of urgency. Perhaps the most powerful blind spot, however, is gradual adaptation. Humans are not designed to notice slow change. If your situation declines slowly, you adjust to it step by step without realizing the overall shift. What once felt unacceptable starts feeling manageable. What once felt temporary starts feeling permanent, and what once felt urgent starts feeling normal. This is why people often don't realize they are stuck while they are stuck. They only realize it when the contrast becomes too big to ignore. But by then time already feels different. Not because it changed suddenly, but because perception finally caught up to reality. And that is the core of it. You don't realize it because your mind is not trying to harm you. It is trying to protect you from discomfort in the present moment. But in doing so, it can quietly disconnect you from the bigger picture of your life. And once you understand that, the real question is no longer why you didn't see it. It becomes what you will do now that you do. 4. What happens if you do nothing? Nothing dramatic happens at first. That is the most dangerous part. There is no single moment where everything collapses, no loud warning, no visible failure that forces you to wake up immediately. Life continues almost normally on the surface. You still wake up, you still do what is required. You still move through your days in a way that looks acceptable from the outside, but underneath that normality, something is slowly settling. When you do nothing, when you keep delaying what matters, when you keep ignoring what you already know, you don't stay in the same place, you don't pause life. You slowly drift into a version of it that is built entirely from inaction. At first, the consequences are subtle. You start noticing that opportunities don't feel as frequent as they used to. Not because they disappeared, but because you stopped being ready for them. When preparation is missing, opportunity becomes invisible. You don't recognize what you are not equipped to act on. And so life begins to pass through you instead of toward you. Then comes the loss of momentum. Momentum is not something you notice while you have it. You only notice it when it is gone. When you do nothing repeatedly, starting becomes heavier each time. Tasks that once felt simple begin to feel overwhelming. Not because they changed, but because your resistance to them has grown. And what once required effort now requires emotional negotiation. You start telling yourself stories that sound reasonable in the moment. I'll do it when I feel ready. I just need more time. I'll start when things settle down. But life rarely settles down on its own. It fills every available space. And while you wait for the perfect moment, the imperfect present becomes your default reality. One of the most serious consequences is identity shift. You don't just delay actions, you begin to shift who you believe you are. At first, you see yourself as someone who is temporarily stuck. But over time, without noticing, you start to accept labels that match your inactivity. Someone who doesn't follow through. Someone who always starts but doesn't finish. Someone who tries but never fully changes. And once identity shifts, behavior follows it. Because you stop acting like someone who is becoming and start acting like someone who is already defined. Another consequence is the shrinking of your options. Every time you delay action, you reduce the number of paths available to you later. Not because life becomes unfair, but because skills, timing, and access compound over time. What could have been opened by early action becomes harder to reach later. And what could have been simple becomes increasingly complex. The cost is not always visible, but it is always accumulating. Then there is emotional weight. Doing nothing does not feel empty forever. It slowly turns into pressure. A quiet, constant awareness that something is unresolved. That awareness builds in the background of your thoughts. It shows up when you are alone. It shows up in moments of silence. It shows up even when you try to ignore it. And the longer it is ignored, the heavier it becomes. There is also the comparison effect that becomes harder to escape. You begin to notice others moving forward, not necessarily faster than you, but more visibly than you. They are making decisions, building direction, changing their lives in ways that create contrast with your own stagnation. And that contrast creates discomfort, not because they are taking something from you, but because it reflects what you are not doing. Over time, this can turn into quiet resentment or frustration, even toward yourself. Perhaps the most difficult consequence is regret formation. Regret does not appear all at once. It builds slowly through repeated awareness of missed chances. It begins as small thoughts. I should have started earlier. Then it grows into reflection. I knew this was important. And eventually it becomes a deeper realization. I saw this coming, and I still didn't act. That final layer is what makes it heavy, because regret is not only about what happened, it is about what was repeatedly ignored. And if nothing changes, that is where the path leads. Not to immediate collapse, but to gradual limitation. A life that becomes smaller, not because possibilities disappeared, but because action never met them. The most important truth is this: doing nothing does not preserve your current life. It slowly replaces it. And what replaces it is not chosen all at once. It is built quietly, one delay at a time. The turning point. There always comes a moment where awareness stops being enough. A moment where understanding what is happening is no longer the issue. You already know. You already see it. You already recognize the patterns, the delays, the repetition, and the quiet consequences building in the background of your life. But knowing alone does not change anything. And that is where the turning point begins, not in more information, but in a decision that interrupts the cycle, because the real problem was never ignorance. It was inertia, the habit of continuing as you are, even when part of you already understands that something needs to shift. This is the point where two paths quietly separate. One path is familiar. It is the continuation of what has already been happening. You return to routine. You return to distraction. You return to waiting for a better moment, a clearer sign, a stronger feeling of readiness. You tell yourself that you will act soon, but soon remains undefined. And undefined time is where change goes to disappear. The other path is less comfortable, but more honest. It begins with a simple recognition. Nothing external is coming to rescue the situation. No perfect motivation, no sudden clarity, no ideal moment where everything aligns effortlessly. If change is going to happen, it has to come from a decision made without those conditions. That is the turning point. Not confidence, not certainty, just decision. The moment you stop negotiating with yourself about whether you should act and start accepting that action is the only way forward. At first, this shift feels small, almost invisible. It is not dramatic. There is no instant transformation. You do not suddenly become a different person. But internally, something changes. Resistance is no longer treated as a signal to stop, but as a signal to move through. And that changes everything. Because until this point, resistance has been controlling direction. If something felt uncomfortable, you avoided it. If something felt uncertain, you delayed it. If something felt difficult, you postponed it. Your behavior was shaped by emotional response. But at the turning point, you begin to separate feeling from action. You realize that clarity does not come before movement, it comes after it. And this realization is what breaks the cycle. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop waiting for conditions to improve. You stop waiting for a version of yourself that is more disciplined, more motivated, or more confident. Instead, you begin to act from where you are, not from where you wish you were. This is where momentum begins to rebuild. Not all at once, but through small decisions that are no longer delayed. One task that is done immediately instead of postponed. One conversation that is not avoided. One step that is taken without overthinking. These actions seem minor individually, but they begin to rewire the direction of your life. Because action changes identity faster than intention ever will. And slowly something important happens. The version of you that used to delay everything starts to weaken. Not because it disappears instantly, but because it is no longer being reinforced. Every time you choose action over avoidance, you reduce its influence. Every time you follow through, you strengthen a different version of yourself. The version that moves. The turning point is not about becoming perfect. It is about stopping the pattern where awareness leads to nothing. Because awareness without action becomes frustration. But awareness followed by action becomes transformation. And from here the question is no longer do I understand what is happening? It becomes what will I do with what I now know? At some point, everything comes down to a simple truth. Not what you understand, not what you intend, not what you once planned for your life, but what you actually do with the time you still have. Because time does not wait for clarity, it does not pause for hesitation, it does not slow down for people who feel unready. It keeps moving, regardless of whether you are aligned with it or not. And that is why this moment matters more than it looks like it does. Not because everything changes instantly here, but because something inside you either continues the same pattern or begins to break it. There is a version of your life that only exists in potential right now, a version shaped by action, consistency, and decisions that were not postponed. That version does not appear through thinking about it. It only appears through movement toward it. And there is another version, a quieter one that is built slowly through delay, hesitation, and repeated postponement of what matters. It does not collapse loudly. It fades quietly, through time that was not used with intention. Most people don't notice the difference while it is happening. They only notice it when the distance between who they are and who they could have been becomes too obvious to ignore. But awareness alone is not the ending. It is the beginning of responsibility. Because once you see it, you cannot fully unsee it again. Once you understand the pattern, you cannot honestly pretend it is invisible anymore. And that creates a choice you cannot avoid forever. To continue as before, or to interrupt what has been repeating. This is where everything becomes personal. Not in theory, not in concept, but in the quiet decisions you make when no one is watching. The moments when you choose whether to delay again, or to act now. The moments when you decide whether your life is something that happens to you, or something you participate in shaping. There is no dramatic switch that changes everything at once. But there is a direction that begins to form from repeated decisions, and that direction eventually becomes your life. So the real question is not whether you understand the urgency anymore. You do. The question is whether that understanding will stay as awareness or become action. Because one leads to reflection later in life, and the other leads to a different life entirely. And that difference is decided in moments like this one. Not later. Now. If this message reached you at the right moment, don't ignore what you felt while watching it. Because that feeling is not random, it's awareness. And awareness only becomes powerful when it turns into action. You don't need to change your entire life today, but you do need to choose one thing you will stop postponing from this moment forward. One decision, one step, one action that proves to yourself you are no longer staying in the same cycle. Write it in the comments. What are you going to start doing now? And if this message made you reflect even a little, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who is also running out of time without realizing it. Subscribe for more videos like this, because some reminders are not entertainment, they are necessary.